Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Michael Watson. I'm the regional lead for Microsoft Reactors in the APAC. And tonight I have the great pleasure of hosting another fantastic installment of the Top 10 Technology Trends series that is by Regional Director, Dr. David Goad. For those of you who are not familiar with David, you're in for a treat. David has an extensive practical experience in information technology and business strategy, having started up his own successful IT services business, which won a number of national and international awards for sales, innovation and service before he sold it. In David's career, he's also managed a number of high performance corporate sales and service teams in well-known companies such as Hitachi, KPMG and Microsoft, just to name a few. I could go on and on about David, we wouldn't get anywhere, so without further delay, I will hand this over to David, and please enjoy his session. I encourage questions in the Q&A part, and we will hopefully get to them at the end, but please enjoy. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Michael. I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. So yeah, hi, thanks. My name's David Goad. I'll introduce myself in a minute, but the topic for today's reactor session is the top 10 technology trends in government. So my planned agenda for the session, and it'll only take about 20 or 30 minutes, and hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes for questions, and hopefully I'll give you guys maybe 10 or 15 minutes back in your evening. So I'm just going to talk a little, do some introductions again about myself and then I'm going to set the scene. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how government has really changed over the course of the last 12 to 18 months. So it's going to be an interesting, I think it's going to be interesting. It's been an interesting 12 to 18 months with COVID. I think it's going to continue to be interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And then what we'll do is we'll get into the sort of top 10 technology trends. And these are based on the most recent published Gartner list, but what I'll do is for each trend, I'll drill into it and give it a little bit of color and talk about what it means from an industry perspective and also from a government perspective. And then we'll have a few conclusions, and then we'll do some Q&A. So yeah, as Michael said, my name's Dr. David Goad. I've been in industry for about 25 years. Only recently, in about the last 5 years, have I been an academic, teaching both at the University of Sydney and University of New South Wales. But I also do a lot of consulting. Do a lot of consulting to corporates around artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and also robotic process automation. So I do a lot of work, both practical and also from a research perspective in those areas. As Michael said, I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director, which means I actively support Microsoft in their product strategy. And in my spare time when I have it, I'm a volunteer firefighter and work for St. John's Ambulance. So government services in the era of COVID. This is an interesting one for me. It's been interesting to see how things have played out, definitely over the last 12 to 18 months. We've all been part of a very real-time narrative in terms of change in narrative, in terms of how government operates, right? And the way I see this is that there's kind of an old perspective, the way government was perceived before COVID, and now there's kind of a new perspective in terms of government. And I think this applies equally to local government in terms of Australia, but also globally as well when I see how other governments work globally. You know, I'm actually background is Canada, so I see how things have been going in Canada. I watch what goes on in the US, and I think there's a lot of parallels across all the different countries in terms of what's been happening. You know, so what was government before COVID, right? There was a general view that people were just a little bit nervous about government, right? They wanted to minimize government. They saw it something that would get in the way of being efficient. You know what I mean? So you have this quote here from Ronald Reagan, right? The most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." So there was a general view, you know, and you had both sides of the equation. You had the left and the right, and there was different views about how much government was the right amount. But generally speaking, there was a view that, you know, less government was better, or at least government was there to try and get out of the way and support the people. And there was also a view that, you know, government was slow, right? That it wasn't responsive, that it was slow to turn, that oftentimes it wouldn't go the way that the people wanted. You know, and there was just kind of this lethargy that, you know, was perceived, whether real or not real. You know, I mean, I know I have lots of friends, and I know lots of people work in the federal and state public sectors, and you know, they're hardworking and they've been working their butts off even before COVID. But there was this perception, right? Now I'd say to you that there's a new perception, and there's a new sort of political reality that's coming along, right? The first thing is, look what's happened with COVID. We're all, you know, working from home, right? There's a whole difference. There's been a change or a fundamental shift in the way that we do things, right? So most people are working from home, and even though we've gone on quite a few months now without a lot of COVID cases, and people are slowly getting back to work, I think everyone that I've talked to has agreed that it's not going to go back the way it was, right? That you're going to still see fundamentally people working remotely. There's going to still be a lot of remote work, right? And we became very, very heavily dependent on the digital channel, during COVID. And I think we will continue to be heavily dependent on this digital channel, right? In terms of commerce, in terms of doing things, in terms of having business meetings, it's all going to be done digitally. And I think the challenge that we've seen over the course of the last 12 or 18 months is a lot of organizations, both government and commercial, said that they had digital capabilities, right? But it's only when the tide goes out that you see as people swimming naked. That's a very famous quote, right? It was only when COVID came along and people were forced to go digital that you actually realized what organizations didn't have an effective digital channel. They weren't capable of doing things effectively digitally, and have had to catch up quite quickly, both on the commercial side and on the government side. I think the other thing that you're seeing is, now there's this era of big government. We're not worried about debt anymore. We're spending money not just on things like JobKeeper and JobSeeker, but on all these infrastructure programs and all these other different activities the government's spending money on, right? Government's considered to be, a prime driver of the economy now, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the countries that you're talking about. But certainly Australia, it's, there's a little bit less worry about spending money, and there's a little bit more worry about being agile, being more responsive, right? Which, has led to a lot of spend in the public sector space, right, in terms of IT spend, right? So, quite a dramatic increase in terms of spending one year to the next, and it's forecast to increase even more. So there's a lot of money being spent on technology to support a lot of these, government initiatives that are coming along, as a result of COVID and a result of the practical realities of COVID. And, let's just all agree, right? I think there's policy and there's principle, but I think that at the end of the day, a lot of what the governments are doing right now, they're kind of making it up as they go, right? This is, as people would say, a once in a 100-year sort of activity or a scenario with COVID, right? And so, the governments that have, and the federal organizations and the states and that have reacted quickly, right, have proven to be the ones that have been more successful. So you're getting this scenario, right? And, the other thing is, by most people's accounts, the scenario that we're in right now, it's probably going to continue for an extended period of time, right? They're talking about the borders being closed for, several years now. Whether you agree or disagree with that, I think that will be an extended period of time where their travel will be limited, and we will be working from home, and we will be in the current business models that we currently have. So you've gone from this fundamental shift, right, of we want less government, we want to control our spending, government is perceived as slow, to all of a sudden now, government's driving the economy, there's more money, the way we live and work has been changing. Government's, it's intended that the government needs to support that, with their digital strategy and how we are working and how we're doing things, and a lot more money is being spent, and there's a higher expectation on the part of, the public sector IT organizations that they need to be fast moving. They need to be responsive, they need to be fast moving, they need to be able to adjust to these new government policies as they're coming out and as they're being created on the fly, right? It's not a case of sitting down and spending 6 to 12 months working things out, or maybe possibly a couple of years to come up with a policy and then go through and implement it. There's a lot of stuff that's happening where some senior politician is, talking about it one day, and 2 weeks later it's being implemented. So there's a lot more need for agility that's coming through in terms of, what has to happen in terms of the government IT sector. So it's in that colored lens, that need for agility, that need for increased spend, that need for responsiveness, that need to be able to manage, these new crises, and look at the number of crises that we've had in Australia, right? Yes, the most recent has been COVID. Actually, the most recent has been the floods. I'm a rural firefighter. I was actually out working, fighting the floods, right? So I had personal experience with that. Then we've had COVID. Then before that was the bushfires. Again, as a member of the fire service and a member of St. John's, I was actively involved in that. We seem to be having all these crises coming, right? And so in the color of that lens of, these national crises that government has had to deal with, and the change in how we're doing things, right? What are the sort of key top technology trends, right, that people see that are going to impact government? And some of these are not new trends. Some of these are trends that were there before COVID that are just being doubled down on or emphasized, and some of them are completely new. So I'll talk through them in order. So the first trend that we talk about is this concept of composable government enterprise, as Gartner refers to it, right? So as I said to you, in an environment, as dynamic and changing as COVID, right? Government systems need to be more adaptive. They need to be more agile in their construction. And so this is what they were, and so this concept of composable design systems assists in this. And it's not necessarily a new concept. This concept of composability has been around in sort of development circles for a year, but it's being raised up a level to really cover off, issues related to how do you do enterprise architecture and system design across the board for government-based systems, right? So what's the definition of composability? Okay, so composability is a system that provides components that can be selected and assembled in various combinations to satisfy specific user experiences and requirements. So think of it as puzzle pieces that easily fit together and can be pulled apart and put in different combinations, right? What does this necessitate, particularly from an information system or technology perspective, right? Well, the first thing it means that all these business systems, these technologies that you're putting into place, they have to be self-contained or modular, right? They have to be able to be independently deployed, right? They have to be able to easily cooperate with other components, with other systems, but they have to be in a situation where they're not dependent on those other components, that those other components can be replaced relatively easily. This allows that agility if you need to be able to change your business systems to support changing or new government policies, right? And they need to be stateless. What that means is that, when they pass information from one system to the next, it doesn't need to require an understanding of what's going on in another system. So that allows these systems to be modular. It allows them to be composable, allows them to be sort of separate little solutions that can be fit together in various different components or in different, assemblies, right? And so we talk about this idea that, you have composable thinking. How do I build these systems so that they're interchangeable? How do I set up the technology to support that? How do I have a business or technology architecture to support that as well? What am I doing in terms of autonomy of these systems, having them so they can automatically discover other systems and work in an efficient manner? How can they be modular in terms of their design? So this is the first thing that people are starting to think about. Again, this was talked about before COVID, but it's becoming even more important now as government organizations re-architect their technology. They have to ask themselves the question, how can I make these solutions composable? How can I make them modular? How can I make them easy to swap in and swap out? So that's trend number one. Trend number two is what they refer to as adaptive security. Okay. Now, there's been a lot of really high profile state actors attacking, both the Australian government and also Australian commercial enterprise, right? To such a degree that, nearly 80% of all senior IT or IT security leaders believe that their organizations don't have sufficient technologies in place to protect themselves if they do get attacked. Okay, so IT security is, has been a serious concern. It's increasing in and of itself. But then if you factor in the fact that with COVID, we're now so dependent on technology from a digital perspective because we're all working at home and we're working remote, and we have this distributed, distributed technology across a number of different, landscapes. We're not all sitting in our offices, not all of it sitting in a data center, right? It's become a main channel for our commerce. Then that means that the impacts of security breaches are even more significant than they used to be, right? So security was an issue, was an increasing issue in of itself. Then with COVID and everything that's been going on, right, now it's even becoming a bigger problem because of the potential impacts, right? And so this has led to certain policy initiatives. For example, the Australian government is committed to spending, almost $2 billion in additional spending on cybersecurity. And the reality is that they're going to have to continue to spend that money. This is not a one-off spend. This is resources and information that they're going to have, investments that they're going to have to continue to do over a long period of time. But the new trend in terms of IT security is what they refer to as adaptive security. So a lot of the security processes and procedures in government used to be policy-based, right? You develop policies and procedures, people had to adapt to those policies and procedures, they had to comply. What they're recognizing now, right, in this increased market where, security is even more important, because we're distributed and all the rest of that, is that they have to be more adaptive. You can't sit there and rely on certain policies. You have to be able to be responsive to when new attacks come in, when new issues present themselves. And so this whole idea of adaptive security is where you're using things like artificial intelligence and automation to be able to respond to provide continuous monitoring and ongoing updates and approvals in terms of security issues and respond to those, right? So, and they say there's a number of different components that goes into an adaptive security architecture. This idea of you need to be predictive, you need to be preventative, you need to have tools in place to be able to detect intrusions, and you also need to be able to be retrospective to look back and see where you've had issues in the past and update and adapt your solutions and your technologies so they're continuing to get better. So this is the second sort of major trend that we see, is this idea of adaptive security in government. A third trend that we're seeing is this issue of citizens' digital identity, and this has been an interesting one over the course of the last few years. I would say that governments have had rocky roads when they've just tried to put in, a common digital identity for their citizens, right? It's always been a challenge, right? Because citizens are concerned about privacy, they're concerned about, access to information, right? But with COVID now, not only do you have this issue where people have to be able to be contact traced, so we have to know where people are, where they're going, where they've been, right? But we also have to be able to, if we have these distributed systems, you can't rely on physical access for people to get access to systems. So you have to be able to have a scenario where an employee will come to government, they will start their job, they will get access to all the systems that they need, they will work, and they will do all that work from home. Right? How do you give them that access? How do you give them that security? How do you validate who they are when they're distributed, right? And so there's this whole issue, not just in terms of government employees, but in terms of people, and how do you create this digital identity from a security perspective, but also to support scenarios related to health management and contact tracing, these kinds of things. And the government's had a few goes at this, right? They came out with My Health Record a few years ago. They got really, really negative response, from a variety of circles, which I would say as someone who works in the healthcare profession as a volunteer, I find disappointing, because I know that as a practitioner, if I go in and I have more information about my patient, right, I can provide them with better healthcare. But the failure of getting broad-based uptake in terms of My Health Record was a challenge. But governments are revisiting it. They're spending a huge amount of money on it because now they're going to need it for COVID, right? They're talking about this idea of having a vaccination passport, right? Being able to go onto the My Health Record and being able to see that, I've been vaccinated with the AstraZeneca or the Pfizer vaccine, and therefore that may, depending on how the arguments go, the most recent arguments about, movability and how people move between states, that may be a requirement, right? So I may find that in the course of the next 6 months, for me to go from New South Wales to Queensland, I'll need to be able to bring up my Health Record and show my vaccination history to be able to cross the border. So these tool sets, even though there's been concerns on the general public around privacy and how they've been used, they're going to become a fact of life, not just from a security perspective, but also from a COVID and a health perspective. So this is something that, this idea of digital identity and how we, identify ourselves is going to continue to be an investment area for government, both at a state and federal level. Again, something that's been talked about before COVID, but it's becoming even more important now, not just with COVID, but also just in terms of just general managing, national catastrophes like the bushfires and that, is this idea of multi-channel citizen engagement, right? With the bushfires, with the pandemics, with the floods, and all these natural disasters, it's become very, very clear that governments need multiple ways to communicate to their citizens. Those ways of communicating to the citizens need to be timely, right? And they need to be closed loop, okay? I'll give you an example, right? I was doing the bushfires last year, right? Very often the Rural Fire Service would use the text messaging capabilities that were built into the phone system to be able to target very specific groups of people who were in danger areas and send them a text saying, you need to evacuate, or you need to, the fire's coming, you need to do something, right? And you see governments already applying this. So in case the Rural Fire Service, not only do they have text messages, but they had, Fires Near Me app. They had, broadcasting it over social networking. They had a lot of different capabilities. And I think what you're going to see is you're going to see governments investing more and more in these abilities to communicate to their citizens, both at a federal and a state level, and even a local level, right? And the way it's not going to just be multi-channel, and it's got to be that, and when they say multi-channel, it's got to be the channel of the citizen's choice, right? So if I prefer a phone, then it should be a text. If I prefer social media, then I should be getting information over social media. If I prefer an app, it's got to be in a channel that I prefer, right? But it's also what's going to become more and more important is closed loop. If I sent that text out to all those citizens that are in that little village that the fire's coming, how do I know that they actually got it, right? How do I know that they're responding? How do I know where they are? How do I know that I need to go and send some firefighters in to go find some people, because it looks like there's a bunch of people who are located in this area who haven't responded to that particular communication in terms of that pending disaster, right? So you're going to see more and more investment in terms of these technologies to make them, to enable more channels, to make them more real time, to provide the ability to be able to communicate more effectively, right? But also to make them closed loop. Again, personal experience, I see this in fire service. They just rolled out a new app that allows us as volunteer firefighters to respond to pages automatically, and it will actually tell where we physically are and give them updates in terms of our time to station. So this is information that's going to be absolutely critical in natural disasters, and you're going to see governments spending more and more money on this level of engagement, not just from a disaster perspective, but just in terms of general processes and procedures and these kinds of things. The fifth trend that I would talk about in terms of technology for the government sector is going to be what I would refer to as anything as a service. It would be fair to say that there's been this general trend over the last, say, 5 or 10 years, and I've been part of that trend, both as an architect and working in industry, of people moving to the cloud, right? So we had this scenario where everyone had their systems on-premise, and then they moved from on-premise to possibly a data center where they were co-locating their hardware in a data center, and then possibly moving to a private cloud, and then possibly moving to a public cloud. And there was a huge and increasing spend in terms of public cloud. Obviously, Microsoft was a big player in that space with their Azure stack, right? A lot of government agencies are investing heavily in Azure, public cloud, putting all their solutions up on the cloud. Everything as a service, right? Either infrastructure as a service, or platform as a service, right? Or software as a service. Now what you're finding is this concept of anything as a service, okay? Because there's just a practical reality around this. What governments have realized, right, is that if you want to be agile, if you need to be responsive, like what's going on with COVID, if you need to spin up new business systems relatively quickly, then the best way to do that and the best way to scale those systems was with the cloud, okay? So you're seeing an ever increasing, the rate of spend in the government and public sector space on cloud providers, on cloud platforms, is increasing significantly. I would say before COVID, it was increasing spend, but there was always a bit of a general reticence. There was issues with regards to data sovereignty, security, these kinds of things. But I think a lot of those issues have either been dealt with or washed away. They've been addressed, and what you're seeing now is that people are spending more and more on cloud. And from a government perspective, cloud, or this concept of anything as a service, will become a predominant delivery model, right? And there's going to be increasing spend more and more. And the reason why they're doing it is because it allows for easy scalability, it allows for quick deployment, right? So a lot of government departments are actively looking at their current on-premise solutions and saying, which ones are good candidates to move them to anything as a service models, either infrastructure as a service, or platform as a service, or software as a service, or something as a service, to again provide us with that agility that we need in these kind of times that are going on at the current point. The sixth trend that I would talk about is this issue of legacy modernization, right? So we talked about composability of apps. So when governments are re-engineering or re-architecting their enterprise, they're trying to make them more modular, more composable. We talked about the fact that there's a general move to cloud-based solutions because, again, they're more agile. There is then this scenario where you might have some legacy applications, right, that you can't move to the cloud, or that their business still business critical. How are you going to fix them? How are you going to upgrade them, right? How are you going to make them so that they are more flexible? How are you going to address some of these other old solutions? And so in concert with a lot of these other technology trends that are going on, right, you're finding that governments are really actively going through their laundry list of applications and asking themselves the question, how am I going to modernize those applications? How am I going to upgrade them, right? They're assessing them. Are they going to re-engineer them? Are they going to migrate them to the cloud? Are they going to get them completely replaced and put them in a new solution? How are they going to quickly put up a minimum viable product to test that the solution is going to work? How do they make sure it's modular? How they give more functionality so that the public actually sees some value in what they're producing? Because oftentimes, you can invest in infrastructure and it's a critical component of any technology solution, but business users, in this case the general public, are like, well, why am I spending all that money? What am I getting out of it? So oftentimes you want to put more functionality in, and how are you going to integrate it? So there's a general trend in concert with all these other trends, where governments are looking to modernize their legacy applications, put them on new platforms. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold going. In terms of case management, then there's another big thing that's going on at the moment. This is this issue of case management as a service, right? So if governments are coming out with new policies, JobKeeper, job seeker, digital identity in terms of tracking people for COVID, you know, QR codes, you know, ServiceNow app to track, you know, where people are and be able to record that so they can do contact tracing. You're developing a lot of capabilities relatively quickly, and all those capabilities are going to need some sort of case management as a service tools to be able to manage the interaction, the natural questions and answers that will come from the public about using those new technologies, about supporting those new government initiatives. And so this idea of having, you know, case management as a service, or a, you know, a composable, anything as a service, cloud-based, citizen digital identity-based, you know, that has the capabilities to do multiple citizen engagement, to be able to spin up, you know, a case management tool relatively quickly, to be able to respond to citizens' questions, queries, to manage the natural conversation that's going to go on back and forth between governments and their citizenry, is going to become even more critical. And speaking as someone who, you know, in my previous lives worked a lot in CRM and case management tools, a lot of the existing tools in government, you know, were very static, were very fixed, were hard to change. You know what I mean? We're very, very process centric, and it was pretty much impossible to spin up a new tool set or to change the tool set to adapt to new government policy relatively quickly. So what they're talking about now is this idea that you want to build case management tools that it can be deployed quickly in an iterative fashion, right, in an agile fashion, using tools like DevOps and, you know, agile project management and things like test automation, to get them out quickly, to be able to support whatever new government initiative comes along, whatever new policy, whatever new queries or conversations, you know what I mean? And it might be completely new case management tools, or it might be just rapid changes to existing case management tools to support changes in policy, right? Because these case management tools are the main sort of infrastructure that government uses to manage their communications on an individual basis with the citizenry that they're supporting. So this idea that you want to have a case management as a service tool, something that you can spin up quickly, that you can adapt to quickly, that's not static, that is dynamic, that can support government policy, is definitely a trend that's you're seeing pick up over the course of last year. Trend number 8, probably one of my personal favorites, hyper-connected public services is what they refer to it as. Gartner refers to it as. If you guys have seen the presentations that I've done for other industry top 10 technology trends, Gartner tends to refer to this as, also in the commercial space, as hyper-automation. This is the idea that you're using some combination of robotic process automation, AI or cognitive process automation, and advanced analytics to automate processes, right? I can tell you that a technology that I've seen is growing astronomically over the course of the last 2-3 years is robotic process automation, augmented with artificial intelligence or AI to do things like recognize diagrams, recognize documents, natural language processing to be able to take a look at inbound emails and, for example, categorize what the person is asking a question about, and then using RPA to basically make sure that that issue gets addressed, right? So using this idea of, you know, RPA plus AI plus advanced BI, combining them all together to automate processes, and not only automating them, but automating them quickly. I'm seeing huge amounts of investment in this in the commercial space. Just about every business organization I've talked to, you know, is investing in some sort of hyper automation tool sets, AI, RPA. I did a little survey on LinkedIn where I asked people, you know, what was the #1 technologies that they thought were looking for resources, and it was a lot of it was around AI and RPA, right? There's a huge amount of demand, and I can see this demand increasing even more. And the reason for this is that, you know, with the restrictions in terms of movement, with restrictions in terms of public, you know, I mean, being able to bring people into the country with the locked borders, right? We're going to have trouble. It's going to drive up demand for resources and people. So using some form of automations to be able to offload those workloads, but also to address the things that I previously talked about agility, about speed, about responsiveness, these kinds of things. So of all the sort of top 10 trends, the one that I think is going to get the most play is this idea of using hyper-connected public services, right? So being able to use automation to automate basic processes, right? Instead of doing very manual processes and copying information from spreadsheets into business systems and back into case management tools, using AI and RPA and that to be able to automate all those processes so that people can focus on the value-added activities and not be working on just, you know, simple manual transactions. Trend number 9 in terms of new technology trends in government is what I would refer to as operational analytics. This is basically, look at organizations and governments have been changing. Historically, they used to build lots of reports, lots of historical data, and they were looking into the past to try to predict the future. Now what they're doing is they're using artificial intelligence and machine learning more and more. Like I said, a huge demand for these kinds of resources to be able to be more predictive, to predict, to make suggestions, to be prescriptive, to identify, potential issues, and therefore provide more responsiveness, right, in terms of government decisions, oversight, these kinds of things. It can be everything from, you can be using AI to do everything from, people have built AI tools, for example, that can predict the next, that are pretty effective at predicting the next, the next COVID or the next version of COVID, right? They can use AI tools to predict demand for certain services. They can use AI tools to, as I said, machine learning and that to be able to identify, where specific, requirements are going to be when citizens have questions. There's all kinds of different applications for artificial intelligence and machine learning, particularly in terms of management. And I personally have had, a number of different conversations with federal government organizations and that around how they could potentially be using AI for everything from managing the borders, machine vision for people coming in, to providing analytics to be able to do reporting, on various issues, all kinds of stuff. There's a huge opportunity in the AI space in government. And my last trend that I would talk about today is this concept of data sharing, which has been around for a while. This idea of open data, governments providing information so that commercial organizations and the general public can provide value-added services on top of that. I think that it's coming even more to play now because, as we've seen over the course of the last year, particularly here in Australia, right, there's this issue that federal governments and state governments have to work much more closely, to be managing the pandemic, to be managing the distribution of vaccines, to be managing, where there's cases of COVID going on and these kinds of things. So, we need to have more open data standards. There's a lot of politics that goes into this. There's a lot of issues and concerns related to sharing data. And traditionally, this sort of data sharing has been project-based. The suggestion is going forwards that it needs to be more programmatic. There needs to be standards, guidelines in terms of how governments can share data between themselves, but also with their citizens, and how that's going to work and how that's going to guarantee privacy and these kinds of things. So you're going to see a lot more conversations around how do you manage data, how do you share it, how do you become more effective and more responsive. So if you sum that all up, these are the sort of what they refer to as the 10 top technology trends. So we talked about this idea of composable government enterprises, or the ability that having modular tool sets that people can kind of plug and play in, and not having them so interconnected that makes it hard for you to put in new systems. This issue of adaptive security or responsive security, supported by AI, by other tools, to be able to respond to new security threats, given that the fact that digital is so important now from a government and an economic perspective, right? This idea that citizens' digital identity is going to continue to be something that's going to be important. We're going to need it for our, our COVID passports, for access to business systems. The ability for governments to communicate to their citizens in multiple different ways, to make that communication closed loop, so that they can ensure that the citizens are getting the information that they need. This idea of being agile, right? So anything as a service, being able to spin up new technologies and services relatively quickly, increased adoption of cloud, the modernization of existing legacy systems, being able to provision case management tool sets relatively quickly as a service type solutions. This idea of using automation, robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, BI, to provide hyperconnected public services, to reduce the time it takes to process various types of transactions, to reduce workloads, using operational analytics, again, based on AI, to be able to do prediction as opposed to looking to the past, to be able to predict new and new threats or challenges into the future. And this idea that governments will have to be able to share data across, state and federal, and also with their citizens. So these are all sort of I would say the 10 key trends in terms of government technology. My suggestion to you, you can go off and you can read. There's you can Google information about these different trends, right, and talk about them. I would suggest to you that if you're involved in government or you're supporting government, that you should sit down and have a little bit of a thought process in terms of, which of these technology trends is going to be relevant to your organization. Are you already adapting these technology trends? You may already be doing them. But if you're not, which ones are the new ones that are important to your organization? I mean, how are you going to incorporate these trends and start to support their implementation? As I said, some of the stuff like around hyper automation or hyper-connected government, I already see a lot of activity going on around that. I see a lot of it, there's already, I gave you guys examples of government spend in other areas around digital identity. The question is, are there other areas in the government layers that you guys might work with, or that the government organizations that you deal with, you need to think about these different types of technology trends. And once you've sort of identified the trends that are important, then start doing some education and some change management. I personally do a lot of master classes, particularly around artificial intelligence and RPA, robotic process automation, just educating business management in terms of what it is, how they can use it to great effect, how they can support themselves. So my recommendation is that you look at trying to do some sort of master classes or starting to educate your business management or your organizational management around how to adapt to these trends, whatever ones you think are most relevant. So in conclusion, like I said, I think there's a lot of changes that have happened because of COVID, because of these national disasters. The role of government has changed. The role of technology in government has changed. It's becoming more agile, more responsive, more need for working together, and you're seeing a lot more spend. If you have any questions, I think we're going to open it up now. Michael, open it up now for a bit of a Q&A, but you're more than welcome to send me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn, and contact me if you have any questions about what we talked about today, or what we talk about in the Q&A in the next couple of minutes. And so that's it for my presentation.
Thank you, David. Maybe you can grab a drink, and I will read out one of the questions. So we had a question from Paul, which was really about, can you expand on the point around closed loop communications? Paul just wanted a bit more sort of detail on that, if you could.
Well, so the idea there is, and this is a common issue in both governments and commercial space, right? You send information out. How do you know that people have gotten that information? How do you know that we're responding to that, right? So the idea of closed loop communications is this idea that somehow you need to be able to identify, whether your citizenry is acknowledged or at least accepted or is responding to that guidance that you're providing, right? Whatever it is, whether it's around vaccinations or evacuating a specific area, or the fact that we need to do people need to go get tested because there's how do you monitor that? How do you know that people are responding? Yes, you can see the statistics at the end of the process, but you want to be more proactive in that regard, right? You want to be able to see real time that the communications that you're pushing out, people are at least, they may not necessarily be doing what you're asking, but you at least need to understand that they understand what you're asking. So that's what I meant by closed loop communications. It's basically that end part where you're validating that the information has gotten out there and then people have absorbed it, right? And being more proactive and not leaving it to the last minute, not waiting until you see people at the evacuation centers to see, oh, did they actually, evacuate from that fire, right? In front of that fire front, or seeing the COVID test results. So what can you do to be more proactive and to be more sort of provide more leading indicators in terms of that communication? Does that answer the question?
Possibly. If there's any more required, please type it in and I will get to it. In the interim, we have another one, which is you talked about the increased focus on building a citizen's digital identity. What are going to be the impacts on privacy, and won't there be resistance to this increased tracking even with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one for me. There's a lot of research and analysis out there right now around these issues of privacy and how do you manage people's privacy concerns, right? There's this concept they talk about, the privacy paradox, right? Where we as individuals, if you ask us if we want more privacy, we'll say yes. But then if you actually observe us to see if we actually do anything about, maintaining our privacy, we're very lazy as individuals to support that. You can see some classic policy failures in terms of digital identity and privacy over the course of last year. For example, in my opinion, one of the more classic failures was when they came up with that COVID safe app, right? Where they basically released that app, and the idea behind the app was it was supposed to help, track people and provide that COVID, that tracking. They spent millions of dollars on that app, and it was a failure. Yet then they came up with something very simpler like QR codes, right? And that's been, a raging success by most people's accounts. Why was that? Well, because there was a basic failure of understanding about how people think about privacy. There's been a lot of research that shows if you ask people for private information, but you make it as an exchange, you say to them, if you give me this information, I'll give you that service, right? Then they're more inclined to do that than if you just ask them for private information out of the block. So I think that the way governments can increase that use of digital identity and ensure that people are actually using the tool sets and complying with that is by making it as part of a process of exchange where they're giving certain services, but in combination of those services, then they ask for more information, right? So I think it's a lot has to do in the execution. So I think if the governments are smarter in terms of how they execute, how they think about things, how they position these products and services, you know, I mean, they'll be able to navigate these issues or these concerns that people have with regards to their privacy and losing privacy potentially, you know, in an era of COVID where we need to do contact tracing and we need to be able to know that you've had your vaccination and we need to, you know all these different things.
All right, we've just got one last question, unless anyone else pops one in. Can you talk a bit more about this concept of hyperconnected public services? And can you provide some more examples, please?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. As I said, it's an area that's certainly undergoing a lot of growth, right? People are recognizing that if they have very, very manual processes, the process that I like to use is the classic. I mean, I know it's a commercial example, but this idea of an invoice, right? Someone sends you a document, you need to read that document. In this case, the invoice. You need to then you know, put some information into a business system. You get the same in government, right? People have to provide documentation. They send you a document. That document has to be read. It has to put in some business system. You then have to respond to it via an email or some other kind of communication. That whole process, right, can be automated, right? You can use machine vision to read the document, to identify the critical information on that. You can use RPA, right, to put that information into the relevant business systems to generate the email. And then you can use modern BI to be able to report across it. The biggest advantage that you have with RPA tool sets in this concept of hyper-connected government is the speed at which you can do it, okay? I can automate a relatively, you know, a standard business process, right, in our government process in possibly 3 to 4 weeks, right? What this means is that, you know, and people sometimes cringe when I say this, but you don't have to have the perfect business process. You don't have to have the perfect operational process, right? Sometimes it's better to automate a crap process and get some support and get some responsiveness than it is to make the process perfect and then build these. And in the past, from a technology perspective, IT folks would say to you, oh, you want to build this new system, you need to figure out how you're going to operate it, you know, go away and generate all this documentation, and we'll spend 6, 12, 18 months to build it and automate it. You know, this whole you know, hyper-connected government, you know, this hyper-automation concept, it speeds it down. You can be responsive and automate these processes in weeks, not months. And so you can automate bad processes and give some relief while you're trying to figure out your way in terms of how that process should be to be improved. So to me, it's a huge opportunity. And I think if you looked at any kind of government department and you looked at the degree of manual processes that they have, right, you'd be able to find huge opportunities in terms of this level of automation. And by automating, using this automation, taking people away from the very basic manual tasks of just putting one information from one place into another and raising them up where they're actually providing more value services to the citizenry, right? So there's all kinds of different examples that I could see in terms of that whole hyper-connected government.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, David. That seems to be it for the evening. Greatly appreciate your time. I'm sure the attendees got some significant value out of that dialogue, and I've seen a great comment from Paul there that we can get to later. Without further ado, I'd just like to thank David again for his time and presenting such a fabulous presentation. If you're looking for further events, please join our Reactor community. Keep an eye out for upcoming events. David's often speaking, and we have others as well. So please check those out, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.